I
Or just
okay.
Yeah.
You okay now?
Okay, yeah.
Okay. I came across the book With Her Own Wings, which is reminiscing about the early days in Oregon, and it was put out by the Fine Arts Department of Portland, Oregon, the Federation of Women's Organizations in 1948. It isn't a very well bound book, so it's not one you loan out much, but the stories were ones that I hadn't heard before, and I thought they were quite interesting. How long do you usually talk? Okay. Well, I got three short little memory things. The second one I'd like to read is from Trace's Rick Stever's book about the Oregon Trail, and so that I'm going to read from both of those. I hope. This is the Barlow Trail Trading Post by Alice Webster. My father and mother came to Oregon in 1853. They stopped on the Sandy River because the oxen were tired. The river abounded with fish and the forest with game. It was a good place to spend the winter, and by spring they saw possibilities of a home there. Father started a trading post on the Barlow Road. Mother planted a garden. It was a good life. I would like to correct the impression that pioneer days were hard. That's not true. We had a happy time with an abundance of food, though it was simple. The streams were teeming with salmon and trout. We had elk, deer, and occasional bear. As the years passed, Father began raising hogs to sell around to the neighbors. Mother always had a garden and kept her seeds from year to year. In the autumn, the cellar would be full. Cabbages hung by roots from the rafters. Carrots, rutabagas, salted salmon, dried venison, dill pickles. We made our own vinegar and soap, the latter from ashes and bear grease. We made jelly from crab apples or Oregon grape. We preserved or dried blackberries, salmon berries, and gooseberries, and gathered wild hazelnuts. With all these riches, our cellar was a wonderful place. Father would go to Oregon City for coffee, sugar, salt, flour, whole nutmeg, sticks of cinnamon, and saleratus. Saleratus is baking soda. Sometimes we had bread. If not bread, we had boiled wheat. Sometimes for 2 or 3 weeks we would not have much except boiled wheat, but we were still lucky. For our clothes, Mother would buy unbleached muslin by the bolt in Oregon City. She would dye the pieces of our dresses brown with ash tree bark. The dresses were all made by hand in one style with a waist and skirt. The children's dresses were fastened in that, and it was a sign of grown up when a girl began to wear her dresses fastened down the front. Our shoes were made by a cobbler who came around once in a while. He cured hides and made shoes, flat, moccasin-like shoes with buckskin laces. We knitted our own stockings. I remember how I learned to knit by making a garter about 1 inch wide when I was 6 years old. We always had sheep, and our mattresses and quilts were made of wool covered with blue denim. We had no sheets and used old dresses for nightgowns. Small children never had shoes or coats. They didn't need them. Mothers had shawls, as it brought from the east, and all girls or women wore sunbonnets. We had happy times, and the school was the center of our social life. The first school in our locality was built on our land, and I remember when Harvey Cross, later a judge at Oregon City, was our teacher. I also remember when we had the mumps. But then Mother tied a piece of salt bark on each swollen cheek with a long piece of cloth, which went under the chin and was knotted on top of the head. We gaily went off to school and discovered that every other child in school was tied up that day too. We were running around the schoolhouse laughing and shouting, the mumps, we've got the mumps," when somebody said, "Here comes Mr. Cross. He had the mumps too." Sure enough, he was all tied up with salt pork, the same as we were, and we had the most hilarious day of school I ever experienced. So far as I know, there were just 2 Indian scares that affected our neighborhood. One was in 1856, before I was born. Father had gone to Oregon City for supplies, and Mother was left home with the small children. About dusk, a courier came by shouting the Indians were uprising. Mother was alarmed, of course, and immediately decided to take the children to the nearest neighbor. The lantern was not very good, and the forest was thick. There was sort of a path, but many fallen trees and the thick underbrush made the going hard, even for an adult. For the children, it was a nightmare, being lifted over large logs and having to roll over logs too high, not so high, and pushing aside branches that flipped into their faces with a cutting sting. At last they reached the neighbor's cabin, but the place was empty. Mother was dismayed and disappointed, and the children were all half asleep. But what could they do but turn around and go back home, over the trail again? Daylight came before we got back to their own cabin, which helped. As they arrived, Father came out. He had heard of the uprising and had traveled by foot all night to get home to his family. All was well, but I don't think Father ever quite forgave our neighbor for going off to the settlement without inquiring about Mother. The other scare was in 1878, the time of the Willow Springs massacre at the foot of Blue Mountains. I think all of eastern Oregon went to the Willamette Valley that night. People went on horseback. There were wagons and wagons that came over the Barlow Road. They camped in our lane and everywhere. The remedies like the salt pork for mumps, which our mother used, were the remedies that were available. Oregon grape was boiled as a concoction for fever and blood purifying. When Father had pneumonia, Mother made a poultice of grated skunk cabbage root. For poison ivy, bush bean leaves were boiled in milk and we were washed with it. Yarrow tea and licorice syrup was given to us when we had colds. Blackberry syrup was used for dysentery, and Mother made tea from sheep droppings for us when we had the measles. The good old days. My mother was always nursing the sick children and helping women at childbirth. I remember how men would come for her at all hours of the night and day, and she would ride off on horseback. After some hours, Mother would be back to tell us about the new baby at somebody's cabin. Church services were held in the schoolhouse with circuit riders came, and we had spelling bees, a debating club, socials, and writing school. At church services, the women and the men were separated, but on social occasions, everyone mingled and all were welcome. People were dependent on one another and had to get along. One never knew when they would need help, and no one could afford to get mad or to be dishonest. Father never refused to help people, and he was always repaid. The old feelings of tolerance and friendship still exist among the families who live together. Yes, it was a good life. Okay. This next one is Reminiscence by Sedalia Rucker. And Sedalia Rucker lived, I asked Zola Yates, I heard it was west of Yamhill, and I asked her, and she happened to have known the lady. She lived when Moores Valley Road just breaks, it comes out of Yamhill and just breaks into the Moores Valley. She lived up there. And so this is her reminiscing. My folks came west on a train and stopped at LeGrand, Oregon. They were looking for a homestead. Dad rounded up a team of horses, got a wagon, and headed for the only land available, the Wallala Valley. I was born there in 1892. 2 years later, Mother caught typhoid and died. When I was 5, Father passed away. No one wanted all 8 of us children, so we were taken one by one. I went to the Reinhardts, Lou and Ella. They were generous people and accustomed to having stray children in their home. I kept track of my family by news I heard. My oldest brother took a harvest job over the mountains, but he drowned while swimming in the Walla Walla. My oldest sister contacted TB and died. I stayed with the Reinhardts, and after the winter of 1904 and 5, Mr. Reinhardt was sick of the snow and cold and said we were moving to a milder climate. He spoke of the Willamette Valley. About this time, a young man came to live with us. His name was Bert Dexter. He was 6 years older than I, but we fell in love. We promised that someday we would marry. Mr. Reinhardt found the land he was looking for in the Willamette Valley, Yamhill County, and came home to get us. He prepared the wagon while Bert and I brought the horses in off the range. We left the Wallace County with a 4-horse team, a wagon, and 6 head of loose Mustangs, which Bert and I drove. The horse I was mounted on was the bell horse. I led. Bert brought up the rear. The first day we reached Tollgate at the top of the Blues, just at dark. They were closed for the winter, but one old fellow was still stationed there, and he let us use the barn. We hayed our horses and slept in the loft. Next morning, we were on the road early and hit the old Oregon Trail outside of Pendleton. The going was rough on account of the farmers hauling wagon of wheat over it. There were chuck holes everywhere. 1 day to Echo and 3 more to the John Day River. As we started to cross, a farmer on the opposite side waved us off and motioned to go further downstream where the crossing was better. For that time of year, the water was high. Bert took the bell off my horse and tied it around his saddle horn and led the loose horses into the water. I watched to make sure he was safely on the other side before I entered the river. My horse was a short-legged pony, and I had to hold my feet in the air to keep from getting wet, but I didn't have a bit of trouble. At the Dalles, we loaded everything aboard a big stern-wheeler. It was like something I'd never seen, a boat so large. Of course, neither Bert or I had ever been out of Walla County before. As we came down the Columbia Gorge, it started raining, and it rained all the way to Portland. Portland was a small town then. Mr. Reinhardt found a livery stable near the dock where we lived, left the horses, and we went uptown and stayed in a hotel. We ate at a Chinese restaurant that evening, and later all of us were sick. The next morning, Mr. Reinhardt still had a bad stomach, but he insisted we start. It rained every mile of the way, and we pulled into Yamhill after dark. Mr. Reinhardt was the only one who knew the way. He'd been there when he bought it. Before long, we were away from town and beyond the houses where we could ask directions. There were no lights. The night was dark, and the rain came hard. We traveled to foothills and began climbing. Dense brush and trees surrounded the narrow road. At night, such a compressed mass of vegetation was eerie. I couldn't tell what the end of my nose was doing. And then behind the trees and in the brush, I saw miniature flashes. I thought they were glowing cigarettes. Bert had taken over driving the wagon for sick Mr. Reinhardt, and since I was alone in back of the horses, I pushed them until they crowded behind the wagon. The mud was so thick we could hardly get through, and as I drove the Mustangs close in, they pinched the team. We continued on and passed through a little valley where there was grass and plenty of it. The Mustangs I was driving were raised in Eastern Oregon, and they'd never seen a shoot of green grass. They stopped. No way in the world could I keep those horses moving. I dropped behind and didn't like it on account I could still see those cigarettes glowing in the dark. I figured they were tramps hiding from us. When we pulled into the yard of our new home, I only had one horse beside mine with me. That was Bert's saddle horse. The rest were scattered up and down the road feeding on the grass. The wagon rolled to a stop after crossing a yard of apples. The ground was covered with apples. The horses put their heads down and started chomping. Mr. Reinhardt broke in the front door to the house. He didn't have a key. There was not a stick of furniture inside, but there was wood in the woodshed, and Bert started a fire in the great rock fireplace. We warmed ourselves, and I said I sure was glad we were there. I told him about the tramps and seeing their cigarettes burning. Mr. Reinhardt laughed. He told me, I just learned what a firefly was. Now, one reason I read this, Dale saw some, they're actually glowworms. Have any of you seen them? Apparently they come out in the fall when it's raining. Dale was out hunting, he saw one. Robert talked once about seeing him walking home in the dark from the Petty place, from Charlie Petty's, but they intrigued me no end. But you're kind of afraid to ask. Maybe they're endangered. I don't know. But I was hoping somebody could say, pardon?
I've seen them in other areas of the country,
No,
but not around
well,
here.
you hear about fireflies, but Dale brought these home. They'd been hunting and it was dark and it was fall, and he brought them. They're like a little flat worm, and I don't know They really intrigue me, but it's kind of, my sister, one time I asked her about the Northern Lights, and she says, well, I haven't seen any good ones since we got indoor plumbing, and maybe that's part of the problem. Well, we have yard lights. We don't look for little lights in the dark. Okay. This is my last story. It's the memoirs by Mariana Hunziker D'Arcy, and she lived from 1842 to 1932. And this is about her childhood. Mother always said, we must settle where we can school the children. So Father sold the St. Helens mill in the fall of 1848 and took our family to Oregon City. Then, as lumber was much in demand both in Oregon and California, he wanted to build a mill above Vancouver on the Washougal River. He and Mother talked it over, and she agreed to put the 4 oldest children in school, take Jacob and Sarah with them, and go cook for him in the mill hands for the summer, if he would buy the place on the Clackamas she had selected for our home. The Sisters of Notre Dame had started a school in Oregon City, and Father arranged for us 3 girls to go to school there. Josephine was 8, Armorita 5, and I 6. Horton, who was 9, was left with Mary Ann Johnson to attend her school. The sisters mothered many a homesick child in those days, and we 3 homesick little girls cried ourselves to sleep every night without giving trouble to anyone. One of the older girls told me most of the girls in the school were orphans. I asked what that was, and she said, their folks are dead or gone to the gold fields in California. I guess your folks have abandoned you and given you to the sisters too. I was so panic-stricken and homesick that I nearly died, for I thought I would never see my mother again. We had not been there long when Dr. Forbes Barclay and Dr. John McLaughlin, who had granddaughters there, came to visit the school. Dr. McLaughlin said, I hear you have some new little girls in the boarders, sister. Where are they? The sister called us to her and putting her hand on my head said, here are our new little girls. That was too much for me. The sisters had said we were their little girls. I burst out crying at having my most worst fear confirmed. Dr. McLaughlin put his hand on my head and tried to cheer me, but I only cried the more and had to be led away. Every Sunday evening, the children gathered for a social hour in the big dining room of the school, and each brought out her treasures. It's hard to believe that not one of those children had ever seen a real doll. We had what we called treasures. The tinsel strips which came off the bolts of muslin, little scraps of colored paper, and best of all, bits of beautiful china which had been broken, but never a doll or a toy. A new little girl from California had come to school, and when she began to unwrap her treasures, all watched to see what she would have. When we saw the doll, there was a quick gasp, then exclamations and questions. But I would not say a word. I was beside myself. I was in ecstasy. I clenched my hands and my heart pounded until I could scarcely breathe. So little beauty had been in my life, and I was so wrought up by the dainty loveliness of the doll that I was not my usual self. I can remember it yet. The girl let me look at her doll and played with it a little herself, then rolled it up in a piece of cloth and held it in her hands. My eyes had not left the doll, and when it was rolled up, I gathered my courage together and went up to the girl saying softly, would you let me hold your doll in my hand for just a little while? Surely, she said, and handed me the doll. Tenderly and carefully, I took it, and going over to a corner, began to unwrap it. Layer after layer of cloth came off, and there it was in my hands. The perfect tiny head with its face no larger than a nickel. The beautiful eyes, the delicate nose. I looked at it a minute in rapture. I loved it. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. I lifted it to my face, and before I realized what I was doing, I popped that little head into my mouth and bit down on it with all my might. The sound of the shattering plaster of Paris, together with the feeling of the doll's head in my mouth, brought me to my senses with a jolt. Sick with grief and fright, I stood for a moment holding the broken doll in my hands. Then, with a hasty glance to see if anyone had seen the tragedy, I made my trembling hands place the broken doll in its wrappings and took it back to its owner. In a voice which did not sound like my own, I said, "Here is your doll. Thank you for letting me hold it." Night came. It was dark in the room where we slept. I could hear the breathing of the other girls and the thumping of my own frightened heart. Outside, I could hear the mournful howling of the wolves, and I tucked my head under the covers and shivered. I wanted my mother. I wanted to slip away and hide my face in her lap and never see that little girl again. I wondered if they would put me in prison or what they would do to a girl who had done such an awful thing. When would I know? Wondering and crying softly, I finally went to sleep. Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday passed, and the other days slowly followed, and still I heard nothing of what would be done to me. Then it was Sunday again, and I was nearly wild with fright that the little girl from California played with something else. Sunday after Sunday passed. I had lived in a sort of sick dread all the time. Once Dr. McLaughlin came to the school, and because I was so afraid all the time, I wept and hid my face in the skirt of an older girl. The dear old factor came and put his hand on my shoulder and tried to comfort me. I thought, he doesn't know, he doesn't know. At last I could bear it no longer. One Sunday I said to the little girl, "Why don't you play with your pretty doll anymore?" She replied, "Oh, didn't you know about that? A rat got in the cupboard and chewed her head off."